It was Fraser who actually changed the face of Australia, because Whitlam got rid of the White Australia policy, or the remnants of it, and cut immigration at the same time, whereas Fraser increased immigration. He was always a big Australian man.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Malcolm Fraser, Australia's 22nd Prime Minister, remains a figure both admired and criticised. He's remembered for ending the Whitlam government and for the reforms that shaped Australia's social fabric. He's a man of instinctive conservatism. He was austere in temperament and cautious in economic management. Yet he also championed causes that gave lasting expression to liberal ideals. He welcomed Vietnamese refugees, laid the foundations of multiculturalism through the SBS, expanded Indigenous rights and advanced human rights protections. Later in life, he famously parted company with the Liberal Party he had once led, convinced it had abandoned the principles he held throughout his career. This year marks the 50th anniversary of both the dismissal of the Whitlam government and Fraser's election as Prime Minister. It's also the 70th anniversary of Fraser's election to the seat of Wannon, the beginning of his political career. These anniversaries remind us just how consequential 1975 was in shaping modern Australia. Fraser's legacy continues to spark debate. Was he too cautious, or was he a principled leader who fused conservatism with conviction to guide Australia through turbulent times? To explore these questions, I'm joined by Margaret Simons, one of Australia's most respected journalists and authors, and she is here at the University of Melbourne as an Honorary Principal Fellow and co-wrote with Malcolm Fraser, the Political Memoirs. So it's lovely to have you here on Afternoon Light, Margaret, talking about Malcolm Fraser.
Pleasure to be here.
And a man you obviously, through the writing of this biography, do we call it biography? It's in the third person, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, it's a strange mixture. And we can talk about how that came to be if you like, but I think, people call it a biography. I don't think that's unfair.
Yeah. You went through that process very closely with Malcolm Fraser, so got to know him very, very well. Why did Malcolm Fraser want to co-author his memoirs rather than write them himself, or just say to you, could you just write them?
Well, he was an unwilling recruit to writing his memoirs, I think it's fair to say.
So you recruited him rather than him?
No, Louise Adler recruited us both.
Oh, right. Yes,
So Louise had been after him writing his memoirs for a long while,
And she was the publisher at Melbourne University Press.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, well known for commissioning political biographies and political memoirs. And yes, she had been pestering him for ages, and he had been resisting, saying that he didn't want to write about the past, he wanted to write about the present and the future, which was very characteristic of him. And she eventually persuaded him by saying, well, what if you have a co-author to help? I was already engaged in writing another book for Louise, one that was never completed, or not yet anyway. And she rang me up and asked me if I would abandon that in order to work with Fraser, who I didn't know well at that stage. I had met him a couple of times as a journalist. And I thought, well, there's an interesting idea. We had a couple of meetings. He thought he was interviewing me. I thought I was interviewing him. And at the end of that, we decided to go ahead together.
Oh, fantastic. I met Malcolm Fraser. I'm sure I met him actually when I was a very small child, because my father actually was his speechwriter.
Of course.
When he was Prime Minister in the very early 80s. But that's not in my living memory, I must say. But I did meet him when he visited Japan as part of some work the Australian government was doing with the Japanese government on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. And that would have been, I think, in 2012, 13, so just a couple of years before he died. But he still then was such a statuesque figure, wasn't he?
Yes. Well, I don't think it was a pairing, myself and Malcolm, that would have occurred to many people. I can't think of half a dozen other people who might have been more obvious suspects for my role. But I think Louise is very good at that. I actually think it did work very well. It wasn't always easy, but I think it worked very well. And, Louise has got a genius, I think, for that, for bringing people together.
Yeah. Oh, great. Tell me a bit about his upbringing here in Victoria, but also in New South Wales. And of course, he ends up at university in Oxford.
In Oxford, yes. No, well, I think this is one of the main misconceptions people have about him. They think of him as a Western District member of the squattocracy. Not true. The place that he identifies most in his childhood is New South Wales, around the Echuca area, Moama, and those areas, which was incredibly remote at the time, and he had a very lonely childhood. So his parents were farming there. It wasn't easy. I mean, they were considerable landholders, but they weren't squattocracy or particularly wealthy. It was a period of significant droughts and great difficulty, and Malcolm was extremely solitary. He used to go off on horseback on his own from a very young age, spend whole days in the bush by himself. And he certainly attributed to that what he thought of as his shyness, others saw as social awkwardness, because he really had no companions other than his sister for much of his childhood.
Yeah, so not a big friendship group growing up, and that does have an impact, I'm sure.
It does. And he was sent to Tudor House boarding school, which he didn't like. Generally speaking, didn't enjoy schooling, really. He would say that intellectually, well, he did say to me, I think he says in the book, intellectually, there's nothing really until Oxford. Oxford was where he really came alive intellectually, I think.
He goes to Melbourne Grammar while the family live at their Collins Street flat. But yes, it's interesting. He's one of quite a few Australian Prime Ministers who are educated at Oxford. And actually we did a survey of Prime Ministers and their university education, and actually most Prime Ministers did not attend university. The more recent ones all attend university. Keating is the aberration. But,
interesting.
But the others were. But the most common university is the University of Sydney. Number 2 is Oxford. It's not Melbourne. Well, Melbourne's number 3. But it's interesting how Oxford had that pull for politically inclined people like Bob Hawke, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, and Malcolm Fraser.
Well, Malcolm was very keen to get out of Australia, really, to distance himself a bit from his parents. He just had a strong feeling that it was time for him to sort of come into his own, and for whatever reason felt that he wasn't fully able to do that in Australia. And yes, it was Oxford where he comes alive intellectually. And you can see at the University of Melbourne has the Malcolm Fraser collection, of course, in the archives. All his essays are there from his time at Oxford. And you can sense, the liveliness of the intellect, him being acquainted with ideas about the rise and fall of nations. He's introduced to Keynes at Oxford and writes, these extraordinary essays full of crossing outs and ideas in the margins and so on. It's fascinating to look through them.
Yes, I can imagine. And I mean, I should say you've been on the committee that oversees the Malcolm Fraser collection here at the university.
Currently chair it, yes.
And that's, of course, one of 2 collections of Prime Ministers that the university has, the other being the Menzies collection. So, 2 nice connections for the university to Prime Ministers, although Malcolm Fraser, of course, never attends this university. Oxford, as you say, it all begins at Oxford. He's influenced by Keynes. He is stimulated by the historians Arnold Toynbee and A.J.P. Taylor, very interested in the big ideas and the sort of, I guess, push and pull events of history that mark its procession.
And the idealism, which was such a huge part of the post-war environment. It seemed possible, likely even, that humanity was going to enter something of a golden era, and he was very much a part of that. And I think that was formative for him and continued to form him through his whole life, really.
He was very concerned, though, about the socialism of the Attlee government in Britain and didn't want to see that repeated in Australia. Do you think that's what inspired him to try and get into politics when he returns to Australia?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Malcolm was a liberal, a classic liberal, in my view. He saw personal freedom as the key and the enduring value throughout his life, I would say. And at that time, he saw the main threat to that as communism, socialism, but communism in particular. And that's what drove him into politics. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He was a Cold War warrior, if you like, through that period. And yes, nothing if not anti-communist and anti-socialist. But it was of a piece with his liberalism. That was why. It wasn't just a sort of instinctive anti-communism. There was an intellectual commitment to it because he saw communism as a threat to individual freedom, the heart of liberalism.
Which I think is how Robert Menzies conceived of it as well. He tries for the seat of Wannon, which he eventually wins, but in the 54 election, and that's sort of in the whole Petrov affair period, and actually Labor wins Wannon. It's hard to think of Labor winning Wannon these days. It seems such a deep blue Liberal seat, although there was an independent who challenged, who's mounted a significant challenge at the most recent election. But he's standing for the seat of Wannon as a Liberal, as a Menzies Liberal Party Liberal. 10 years after the creation of this Liberal Party, does he identify wholly with Liberal Party principles, or is it just the neatest box in which he can fit?
I think he identifies with liberal, small l, liberal principles, and saw the Liberal Party as the best expression of that in that political environment. It's easy to forget how young he was.
So young.
Of course.
24 when he runs for the first time.
And, really young. But he was, as I say, a great optimist about the future of the world, not only of Australia. He saw the Soviet Union as the great threat, and China to a lesser extent. And in the Australian context, he saw the Liberal Party as, yes, the natural party. His father had also been involved in politics, mainly local politics, and had also been a part of some of those fairly shadowy anti-communist movements in the Western District. So the anti-communism is the consistent theme through the family politics, rather than, obviously, as you say, the Liberal Party was still a relatively new creature.
Yeah. He must have been quite precocious, though, at 24 to be running as a candidate. I mean, he's pre-selected, so they obviously saw something in him. But he was shy, or at least socially awkward, as you say. How did he go on the hustings? Did he find that challenging, do you think?
I think he found it very challenging, but he was pretty good at it, really. I mean, he worked hard at it. He also made full use of radio, of local radio. Again, one of the great treasures in my mind in the Malcolm Fraser collection, the transcripts and in some cases audio of his radio addresses to the electorate, which he started in the very early stages every week. And he kept this right up until the end of his political
career. These are the Our Australia series.
Yes, that's right. And they're extraordinary.
Was he, I guess, doing a Menzies in the Forgotten People broadcast? Was it in that sort of vein that he had a sense of his own destiny, that he might one day be Prime Minister, do you think?
I don't think at that stage he dreamt of that. I don't think he was self-consciously in the Menzian tradition that way. I mean, that may be an idea that grew on him later. He didn't know Menzies. Of course, he was, very young in a sort of rural, marginal electorate. He didn't get to meet Menzies, or might have met him, but he didn't get to know him until quite a lot later. I think he was a modern person who understood the capacities of media. I think he was always pretty shrewd about using the media. And he correctly saw radio as a way of reaching directly into the living rooms of the electorate. But really, I mean, people ask so often, did Fraser change? And he did change, of course. We all do. It'd be very strange if he hadn't changed. In some areas he changed, very completely. His attitude to the Vietnam War, for example.
And to the United States.
And to the United States, indeed. But I think the answer is in those radio broadcasts. The same ideas he was talking about in his last years are present in those broadcasts that he was making in his mid-20s.
Yeah, I mean, that respect for the individual, commitment to individual liberty under the law, and this principle that the strong should protect the weak, which of course is noblesse, in some ways can be characterised as noblesse oblige for someone of, Western District's farmer, coming from relative privilege, that he should see his capabilities as being best used to help the needy in society.
This is one of the things that divides him. If we see the Liberal Party as obviously being the broad church, this is what divides him from the libertarian part of the Liberal Party tradition, I think. He always saw a significant role for government. As I say, individual liberty, very important. Certainly he was, low taxation, those sorts of things. That's one of the big departures from Whitlam. But he was always somebody who saw a role for government, and that's about protecting the weak. I remember asking him, what do you mean by liberalism? And he would start with individual liberty, individual self-determination, equality of opportunity, and the strong protecting the weak.
Now, and I think that would have been in the Menzies tradition too. That,
he certainly thought so.
He thought that government should step in when required, this shouldn't be a completely sort of libertarian capitalist society that's unchecked, that the government should moderate capitalism where required to ensure that the weak are protected.
Absolutely. And, that's one thing in which he didn't change. Exactly how it expressed itself at different times changed, as you'd expect. But, of course, Menzies, as you would know better than anyone, can be contested territory. But Malcolm certainly would have seen himself as largely in the Menzies tradition, I think, as he understood it.
He obviously doesn't know Menzies personally when he's first elected, and he's by this stage just 25. But how does his relationship with Menzies unfold?
Yeah, well, he didn't really, he came to be quite close to Menzies later when he became a contender for the leadership, and certainly in the lead up to the dismissal. But at this stage, he didn't really know Menzies at all. He saw Menzies as this godlike remote figure who he was broadly supportive of. But, he didn't really have a relationship with Menzies to speak of. Menzies wasn't a huge influence on him at this stage, other than in that sort of abstract sense.
Yes, but I guess Menzies loom large. He's the party leader. He's the Prime Minister.
Creator of the party. Yeah.
Malcolm, yes, exactly. And Malcolm Fraser moves to Canberra. So they're in the same, I was going to call it a city. It is our capital city even then, but it was a small town. They're in the same town. Old Parliament House is quite an intimate building, much more so than the new Parliament House. So he would have had quite a few daily interactions almost.
And gradually over time he got to know Menzies better and Menzies got to know him better. But yes, other than in the very general sense, he didn't have an intimate relationship with Menzies until much later.
Malcolm Fraser isn't appointed to the ministry until Harold Holt's prime ministership, so he's in Parliament for 11 years. Some might say, well, that's not very good, I guess, elevation through the ranks. Some people can enter the Parliament and the next 2 minutes they're suddenly in the cabinet. But of course he was elected so young. He's a minister in the outer ministry by the time he's 36. So, that's still pretty young, let's be honest, in today's terms.
And there were a lot ahead of him. People forget just how many people did enter Parliament for the party through those years. There were plenty ahead of him in terms of seniority, and he was very, very young. And green, yeah.
Do you think that's why he was overlooked for promotion? There were just too many, say, Victorians in the cabinet, in the ministry. This state used to be the jewel in the Liberal crown, so had an enormous number of parliamentarians from the Liberal Party from Victoria. So
I think that's the main reason. I suspect that also his social awkwardness. He didn't have much talent for self-advancement or much time for, pleasing and so on. I think he learnt those skills later, obviously, as anybody with prime ministerial ambitions has to. But, I don't think he was the sort of person who was constantly thinking of his own advancement in quite that way, or at least not until later.
You don't think Menzies might have got a sense that Fraser and he differed, say, on foreign policy issues around, Britain's entry to the EEC and sort of inevitability of that? Fraser accepted and thought it was an opportunity. Or on apartheid in South Africa, Fraser was already very, very, arguably Menzies was concerned about it too, but just said we can't interfere in the affairs of other members of the Commonwealth. But Fraser was more outspoken.
I think there definitely were differences. The extent to which Menzies was aware of them and was weighing them up, as far as I'm aware, and you may be able to tell me differently, I don't think there's any documentary evidence to suggest that was weighing on Menzies' mind. I think it was mainly youth, plenty of others ahead of him, and perhaps not a great talent for self-advancement in terms of, pleasing people and making himself noticed in those ways. Of course, that changed. All of that did change.
His first portfolio is Minister for the Army under Harold Holt. And, this is at a time when Australia is involved in Vietnam. And he has to, in this position, oversee conscription.
Yes.
Which is a Liberal, someone who believes in individual liberty, must have been a really big challenge.
A matter of considerable conflict. And again, he reflects on that in some of the radio addresses. I think basically at this stage, Malcolm supported the Vietnam War. I put to him once that you believed in the domino theory, and he said, not really the domino theory, it was more complex than that. But broadly speaking, he accepted that the Vietnam War was largely about communism and the communist threat, and that it had to be fought in order to addressed that threat and that conscription was justified in that context. But he did recognise the conflict, as I think anybody would with a brain, but he thought it was justified. Of course, Minister for Army, a ministry that doesn't exist these days, it was largely an administrative post, really. I mean, there was a Minister for Defence as well and a Minister for all the other armed services. So it was, it was a very junior ministry, more so than one might think.
Yes. Obviously, Harold Holt dies tragically at the end of 1967, and Fraser is made Minister for Education and Science in the Gorton government and then Defence. Is this moment when you get an inkling that Malcolm Fraser may have his eyes on the leadership one day?
I think it grows on him. I mean, the way he put it to me was, gradually you look at yourself and what you know of your own capacities, and you look at those around you and think, well, why not? And of course, others were looking at him as well. People like Tony Staley and so on were spotting his talent, perhaps a little later than this. So yes, I think it grew on him gradually to think, why not me? And the ministry, Defence Ministry particularly, I mean, he remained a huge supporter of the American alliance until his later life when he changed his views. But as Minister for Defence, he got a very close-up look at how badly the USA can treat its allies, even back then. And very often decisions were made that had key effects on Australian forces without any consultation. And he was furious about that. But he kept it in-house, if you like. And he did that right through his prime ministership as well. When there were disagreements within the alliance, he was very focused on fixing them to keep the alliance together rather than undermining it. He changed his views on that in later years.
So you don't feel like his time as Minister for Defence defined his views on the alliance? It was just part of his evolution?
No, I think certainly when in later life, of course, he wrote a book saying that we should basically, not entirely ditch, but certainly gain more independence in foreign policy. And that was informed partly by his experience as Minister for Defence. But at this stage, he thought the alliance was crucial to address the communist threat. And of course, the big change, those who think Malcolm changed, the big moment of change is the collapse of the Soviet Union. At that point, communism is no longer the great threat. And other aspects of his liberalism come to the fore there. So, he changed partly because the times changed.
We're getting ahead of ourselves, of course, but he says the interests of the United States and the interests of Australia are not necessarily identical. But he was very underwhelmed by Jimmy Carter, who is often ranked the worst US president. So I suspect many people were underwhelmed by Jimmy Carter. But Reagan represented a great US president in Malcolm Fraser's eyes.
Absolutely. Yes, Carter, he thought, was basically incredibly naive and gullible, that he was basically taken in by the Soviet Union, believed them. And then towards the end of the Carter presidency, he saw him as sort of getting a bit more of a grip on the realities of the Cold War. But yes, he was largely unimpressed with Carter. But, he was very critical privately and in his personal papers, again, which are in the archives. He was very critical of the Americans in many ways, but he kept it in-house because he believed in the importance of the alliance.
Yeah. So he had that discipline. His relationship with Prime Minister Gorton deteriorates and he ends up resigning from cabinet.
And bringing Gorton down effectively.
And precipitating Gorton's demise.
Something which some in the party have never forgiven him for.
He says in Parliament, which has echoes of Page, Earl Page on Menzies, I do not believe he is fit to hold the great office of Prime Minister and I cannot serve in his government. We've heard those words before in Parliament, but this was throwing down a gauntlet, putting himself in the back bench, but also undermining the Prime Minister, not just the party leader or an opposition leader, it's the Prime Minister.
It's huge.
And potentially bringing down the whole Liberal government that, had been in office since 1949.
Well, here you see Malcolm's character, I think. He was not a man to ever think that the right thing to do was nothing or to back off in a crisis. So, yes, his relationship with Gorton, which was never close, but it deteriorated. And there were a number of issues behind that. One of the huge points of conflict was states' rights. Malcolm was always a states' rights man. Mm-hmm. That's of a piece with his liberalism. He didn't believe in having too much power in any level of government in the Australian system or generally. So he was always in favour of states' rights, and Gorton, of course, was less of a states' rights man. He was more of a focusing power, particularly over land and sea. We can go into all the technicalities of that if you want, in the hands of the Commonwealth. So that was an area of conflict. Malcolm also thought that Gorton had tried to use the Defence Forces inappropriately in a dispute in Papua New Guinea. Again, the details of this are probably more than you want to go into here. But he saw that as a matter of principle, and it was resolved. But in that speech that you just quoted from, he raises all that again, not because it hadn't been resolved at the time, but because he saw it as emblematic of what he saw as Gorton's flawed character and unfitness to lead.
McMahon takes over from Gorton. I mean, what's Fraser's view of the change?
Well, he had nothing but contempt for McMahon.
Yeah, which is a commonly held view.
Commonly held view. I remember having discussions with him about whether McMahon or Billy Hughes was the worst Australian Prime Minister. I can't remember what his opinion was, but he certainly didn't have a high opinion of either of them. He thought, again, as is common and I think established in the biography that was recently written of McMahon, that he leaked, that he was untrustworthy. And it's certainly during this period, I think, that both Malcolm himself and others around him begin to think, well, the contrast in the calibre of the people is such that Malcolm clearly becomes an alternative.
But Mum appoints him Minister for Education, so, all can't be lost in that relationship, despite Fraser's huge scepticism about McMahon's leadership.
Yes. Well, then as now, of course, if you have a talented and ambitious minister, you can't entirely overlook that. McMahon would have had a view on all that as well. And education was a very difficult area for the Liberal Party at that time. Of course, there was a whole load of controversies over Commonwealth aid for independent schools. Sectarianism was still a big issue in education. University education, of course, not free at that stage, but there were generous Commonwealth scholarships for students of talent, something which people tend to forget when they talk about Whitlam making education free. I mean, the truth is that many talented students were able to go to university virtually for free because of the Commonwealth scholarships. Malcolm greatly increased Commonwealth spending on education. He was very keen, again, of a piece with his liberalism on universities being independent of government. He was very suspicious of attempts to have control over curriculum or over academic freedom. So, yes, he was very committed to the portfolio.
Yeah. And look, during this period and subsequently after the Liberals and McMahon lose the 72 election to Whitlam and ending 23 years of consecutive Liberal Party Prime Ministers and coalition rule, I mean, Malcolm's clearly got his eye on the leadership and that he has a particular take on where the Liberal Party should go and that it needs to really, I mean, once they lose government, of course, it has to go through a period of rebuilding. I was fascinated. He's giving the 5th Alfred Deakin lecture in 71, outlining his vision of a Liberal leader as tough, bold and philosophical, presumably words he would use to describe himself.
I think he would like others to use them to describe him as well, yes.
I mean, obviously in 74, when he's really stalking Billy Snedden, who's opposition leader of the Liberal Party at the time, he gives a commemorative dinner speech to RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, contrasting the ideals and realities of the Liberal leadership. He's writing articles about how the Liberal Party's lost its sense of purpose and direction and needs a leader who would reassert Liberal principles, and he says the same things in his Robert Garran Memorial Lecture. So you get a sense of déjà vu too today.
Exactly. No, at this stage it's definitely on.
Yes.
I mean, he believes that the party basically deserves to lose to Whitlam. He thinks it's out of ideas and out of energy and out of principles. And yes, that's the context in which he's positioning himself as an alternative. And I think that's quite conscious. But it's a reaction to what he saw as the ills of the party at the time. And as you say, there are certainly parallels today.
He has a few goes at challenging for the leadership, doesn't he? And eventually becomes leader in March 75. And then, of course, the dismissal takes place on the 11th of November 75.
A hectic few years.
Yeah.
But, I was talking about him acting against Gorton earlier on. My view is that you can see exactly the same character traits in him deciding to bring on that crisis,
right,
as you see later during the dismissal. Malcolm was, in my view, a liberal activist, two words that don't often go together. There's virtually no time in his career where he's faced with a crisis and he thinks, I think I'll just wait and watch here.
I'll sit this one out.
Maybe
it's not the Malcolm Fraser way.
That's right.
Yeah.
He sees a crisis and he sees himself as the kind of man who must act in a crisis. And you see that with Gorton, you see it in the dismissal.
And I guess with Snedden too.
With Snedden,
a Liberal Party direction, purpose crisis, and he stalks him sort of like a shark.
Exactly.
He's politically ruthless.
Yeah. Also, and this is something I found interesting about him because he was socially awkward in many ways, but he was a terrific judge of character, in my view. And he judged Kerr. I mean, given that we're coming up to the dismissal now, he knew Kerr. It had to do with him during his time as Minister for Defence. Kerr had led an inquiry into Defence Force wages and so on. And he assessed Kerr, in my view, entirely accurately and used that to his advantage during the blocking of supply and the lead up to the constitutional crisis. Of course, Whitlam signally, although in many ways he thought he knew Kerr better, Whitlam completely misread the man.
So that sense that Kerr wanted to do the right thing and Malcolm, he exploited that, would you say, or is that too strong a word?
I think he played him, yeah. It was very important to Kerr, Malcolm saw, and he saw this from his previous experience when Kerr was leading this inquiry, very important for Kerr to be thought of well.
Yes.
He cared deeply about his reputation.
Yes, and which of course must have caused him great anguish after the dismissal when he was pilloried and really driven out of Australia for a long time. Yeah.
So Malcolm, was saying to him as the crisis deepened, if you do not do these things, the opposition will have to criticise you. And he said that knowing the impact those words would have on this man. And it wasn't the first rodeo between the two. There'd been this Defence Force inquiry that Kerr was meant to be heading, and apparently he was pretty much constantly in Malcolm's ear, making sure the minister would like the recommendations, making sure that Kerr would not be criticised.
That sort of born to please mentality.
Exactly. And Fraser noted that and used it.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, history tells that Whitlam completely misread the man.
Yes.
Didn't take the time to know him really or to understand him.
Yeah. Malcolm Fraser was quite reluctant to talk about the dismissal. There's a sense, well, maybe that horse has been flogged to death and there's nothing more to say. But, of course, Whitlam, some might say, was martyred by the dismissal and, 1,000 days in office, an economy really on its knees, a political crisis. His prime ministership is not
loans affair, which was messy,
the
to say the least.
Affair. Look, his and problematic ministers. His prime ministership, if it had just gone the normal way, might have actually ended up being really a disappointment and one that's considered along the lines of maybe McMahon and Billy Hughes with your rankings. But because he's martyred, there are some in Australia, historians, probably, Labor Party activists who will say it was a great era, the 3 years of modernising Australia, end of the Menzies era, and we got on with making Australia a modern country. So, Fraser's role in this martyrdom is sort of critical to an understanding of Australian politics and Australian history. So,
why did he not want to talk about it?
No.
Well, he did initially, of course. He got fed up with talking about it later because he felt, and I agree with him on this, that the dismissal overshadowed what he actually did in government.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. That's one of the reasons I'm involved in a symposium that will be held later this year, because it's all anybody knows. And, I'm slightly irritated to see the Museum of Australian Democracy doing the dismissal again. I'm not saying that it's not important. Obviously, it was a key moment in Australian politics and a significant crisis. But, my goodness, it has been done and done and done and done. And yet the record of government including areas of commonality and difference between Fraser and Whitlam, has been almost neglected by the scholars. There's a very, very few exceptions to that.
Yes.
And that is anti-historical, damaging to the Liberal Party, damaging to our understanding of the country. And I hope that it will be addressed. I hope that the 50th anniversary of the government will cause people to reflect, and I'm not suggesting uncritically, on the record of government. Obviously, the dismissal was also important. But Malcolm himself told me, and says in the book, that he thought Kerr would warn Whitlam.
Yes. And
that once warned, Whitlam would agree to an election which he would contest as Prime Minister. Now, the Liberal Party almost certainly would have won such an election.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there's much doubt about that.
Which, of course, was why Whitlam didn't want an election.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's interesting to think how differently we would regard our history if that's the way it had turned out.
As I said, he wouldn't have been martyred then.
If there had not been a dismissal, if he had simply lost an election that, yes, he was forced to hold, then I think we would talk much more about what Fraser actually did as Prime Minister and perhaps not quite so much about how he became Prime Minister. It still would have been a significant crisis, of course, if that's how it had played out. But as we know, Kerr did not warn Whitlam, and history played out as we know.
Malcolm Fraser had no regrets, though, about what he did. He thought the country was in extremis, that the economy, if he hadn't done what he did and Kerr done what he did, then the economy might never have recovered. Australia would have been...
He thinks, yes. I mean, he never said anything to me, and as far as I know, has never said anything to anyone to suggest that he had any regrets or second thoughts. My own view is that in his secret heart, he might have conceded that what he did overshadowed his record as Prime Minister, and that was a political mistake. He would not acknowledge that it was in any way a mistake of principle. And, of course, others around him thought that at the time. In the archives, there's this tremendous letter from Ian McPhee, written on the eve of blocking of supply, saying basically that if we, I want you to be Prime Minister, we all do, but if we come to power like this, it will mean that, the record of the government will be tainted in the minds of many. And I think that is exactly what has happened.
So, as you say, the record of the Fraser government that lasts so he takes over as Prime Minister in November, but there's an election shortly afterwards. In December, he's elected with a massive majority. He does really well. The public are behind him. And then he's Prime Minister until, of course, Hawke topples him in 1983. So, this is a long period of time. I think I'm going to get this wrong, I wrote this down. He is the third longest serving Liberal Prime Minister. Obviously Menzies and then Howard.
And yet the Liberal Party
barely
doesn't like to look at him at all.
No. But tell me about his government's achievements.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously the period of Whitlam, you talked about the argument that it was modernising Australia and also that it was a time of huge crisis, the Loans Affair, huge problems. I mean, both things can be true. People tend to think, perhaps particularly politically involved people tend to think in terms of binaries, Whitlam good, Fraser bad, or the other way around. And of course, both can be true. Whitlam was a modernising figure. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And so was Fraser. And there were areas of continuity between them.
And so was Holt.
And so was Holt, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. I mean, it was Holt and Whitlam who dismantled the vestiges of the White Australia policy.
Yeah.
There was a great deal of bipartisanship on that if you look at it closely. But it was Fraser who actually changed the face of Australia because Whitlam got rid of the White Australia policy or the remnants of it and cut immigration at the same time, whereas Fraser increased immigration. He was always a big Australia man.
And Whitlam didn't want Vietnamese refugees. He said he didn't want to import
Southeast Asian bolts or whatever.
Yeah, Southeast Asian bolts because he'd seen people fleeing communism from Europe in the Menzies era coming to Australia and being anti-communist and therefore anti-Labor and voting Liberal. And he thought, well, I don't want those Southeast Asian bolts as he
relevant to current debates.
Very relevant to current debates.
But no, I mean, Fraser was always, again, from his earliest days, a big Australian man. He thought we should have many more Australians. He was, I don't think anybody, even his worst enemies, would dispute that anti-racism was a consistent thread throughout his life. And so there was no question of the White Australia policy. He thought that was anathema.
Although in the 50s, in his early speeches, he does talk about this yellow peril.
One of them, one speech.
So I mean, look, we'll, grab onto it as evidence that he changed.
Well, no, there was one speech in which he fairly conventionally talks about he doesn't use the word yellow peril, but he talks about, the hordes of Asians existing on a pannikin of rice a day, gazing enviously at Australia's wide open spaces, or words to that effect, all fairly cliched language from the time. One speech. Most of the rest, all of the rest, I would say, with some confidence, he is vehemently anti-racist. He travels widely in Southeast Asia, both as Minister for Army and even as a backbencher. He engages, including with communist leaders in Indonesia and so on. He's engaging in Southeast Asia very widely. And, he was not racist and he was anti-racist.
Well, and as you say, he changes the face of Australia, so allowing 70,000 Vietnamese refugees into Australia, and there's a statue honouring his contribution to Vietnamese Australians' freedoms that they were able to find here in Footscray. I mean, he's considered a great hero.
Later Lebanese migrants. The practical end of the White Australia policy comes with Fraser. And if we're talking about contributions, that's probably his single biggest contribution, but there are others.
Well, establishing the Human Rights Commission.
Yes.
Setting up the Administrative Appeals Tribunal.
Freedom of
Information laws, which, maybe under threat these days.
Commonwealth Ombudsman.
Yeah.
Continuing what Whitlam started with Aboriginal land rights, with the slight exception that he was very reluctant to overrule premiers. This is part of his states' rights thing. That's something he changed his mind on. He wished he'd been tougher on that, I think, in later life. But the reason he wouldn't overrule Bjelke-Petersen and so on was because of his belief in states' rights. So it was a conflict of principles there. Yeah, so...
We've touched on his foreign policy earlier, but it's interesting by this stage, a protege of Menzies. He visits him in retirement and is quite close to him. I mean, Menzies is painted as this, Anglophile and then, pro-US alliance. Of course, ANZUS Treaty is signed by the Menzies government in 1951. I think it's often overlooked that the Menzies government was very realistic about Australia's future lying with Asia, and of course signs the Commerce Agreement with Japan in 1957, and our exports are reorienting to Japan and to Asia. And there were geopolitical reasons for that as well as economic reasons. But it's interesting that Fraser's first visits overseas as Prime Minister are not to London and Washington, but to Beijing and Tokyo.
Yeah. Well, one of the frustrations in the way that sort of popular political history is written is that people tend to see, huge changes. So Keating is often credited with saying we have to find our future in Asia, not, against Asia.
Yeah, why does Keating get a lot of credit?
It started before then, I would say.
And I'm always amazed that Whitlam gets all this credit for discovering Asia when it was, the evidence is quite to the contrary. I mean, obviously he goes to China, which is, a very significant part of the story.
Yeah.
But
there's continuity there, across both sides of politics, with differences, of course, because the times change. But no, there is continuity, and Fraser was certainly part of that and played a significant role there.
He shifts, do you think, from being anti-communist per se to being anti-Soviet, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan confirms his view that one of the biggest risks to world peace is Soviet expansionism.
Yes.
I mean, you wonder what he would have thought of what's happening in Ukraine now, but also, the Crimea. He would have been still alive, of course, in 2014 when Russia invaded the Crimea. I mean, this resurgence of Soviet, now Russian expansionism is a real threat to world peace.
And to liberal values.
Or to democracies,
Yeah, no, well, he grew, I think he would acknowledge this, more sophisticated in his understanding of what was going on in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. He came to understand Vietnam much more in terms of nationalism rather than in terms of, the domino theory and communism pushing down. He certainly got to understand China a lot better and visited China several times. You probably got the number of times at your fingertips, I can't remember, and saw it as a very different sort of expression of communism. So I think he gradually became more sophisticated in his understanding of different expressions of communism And yes, you're quite right, saw the Soviet as the main threat. And the invasion of Afghanistan he saw as an enormous threat because he thought, what's to stop the Soviets pushing on into the Middle East, controlling the world's oil supply, which, then was huge. Well, still would be hugely significant, but even more so then.
Yes. We are. This is all hypothesis, and you're a journalist, so you probably don't mind. Historians won't like this, but I mean, he says the ideology of regimes is not irrelevant, but it cannot be the guiding principle of our policy.
That's a view he comes to, I think, in middle age and later.
Yeah.
Not something he would have said at 25.
No, quite. But he would have seen the rise of China through his career and post-political career. And by the time he dies in 2015, I mean, China is militarising the South China Sea, it's saber-rattling in Southeast Asia and, of course, with Taiwan. I mean, would he have seen Chinese expansionism as the same order of threat to global peace as Soviet expansionism or Russian expansionism?
It's a really interesting question. Of course, he wrote a book on foreign policy called Dangerous Allies, which was published not long before his death, 2014, I think. I looked it up earlier, but I've forgotten it already. And 2014, it was still, I visited China quite a lot through those periods, and I think it was still possible to be broadly optimistic that China was going to continue to liberalise and continue to engage in a constructive way with the world community. And Malcolm believed that. Would he still believe it now? I remember visiting universities in China in 2013, 2014, the early days of the Xi presidency, and having conversations in classrooms with students and other academics, very similar to what happened in Australia, no sense of risk or whatever. That changed. By the time I was visiting in 2016, 2017, people were very much more frightened and careful. Now, would Malcolm have changed his views on China? Because he was, broadly speaking, very optimistic about China, didn't think Australia should go to war over Taiwan, for example, if it came to that. I think it's a really interesting question. It would be fascinating to know what he'd be saying now. I suspect he would have shifted his views, but it would be because China has changed.
Yeah,
yes.
which would be fair enough. Yeah. Margaret, you wrote this book over 10 years ago, of course. Would it be a different book today? I mean, Malcolm dies at a fair age, but he definitely could have lived longer.
Well, he was actively, I was meant to have lunch with him the week after he died. His death was a shock.
Yes.
He had been well. He went into hospital for a minor procedure, and just a cascade of bad events led to his death. But he was still very actively involved. He had left the Liberal Party, of course, something we haven't talked about, but we can. But he was actively involved in trying to found a new political party, which was taking up a lot of his time. I wasn't involved in that. I'm too much of a journalist to get involved in such attempts. But I knew about it. We would often meet and he would talk about it. And while those attempts ended with his death, some of the same people are now involved in the Teals.
Yes, I was going to say, would he have welcomed the Teals?
I think so. His granddaughter, Samantha Marshall, has written a piece saying that she thinks he would have been backing at least some of the Teals.
Yes.
People tend to lump the Teals all together, and they're in fact quite different people, I think.
Yeah.
But yes, I think he would have been broadly in favour of liberal, small L, liberal alternatives in politics. It was Tony Abbott becoming leader of the Liberal Party that immediately precipitated his leaving, but he was considering it much earlier than that. I just recently had a conversation with Tammy in which she recounted some of the conversations they were having through the Tampa affair and the Children Overboard affair.
Yes.
Both of which deeply distressed both of them.
Yes. He said that I didn't leave the Liberal Party left me. Others will disagree and say he moved to the left and the Liberal Party stayed in the centre-right, and in the end each party leader has to cast the Liberal Party in the way that the leader views it. That's how that political side of politics works. You're not locked in, it's not stuck in aspic. What you believe in 1944 is what you believe in 2025 as a political party. I mean, he clearly changed his mind through his life.
He did. I'm not going to deny that. You'd be daft to deny it. But the world changed.
Yeah.
So I've referred to the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union. He saw that as I mean, obviously it was world-changing, but he saw it as changing just about everything about how liberalism should be expressed. So the Soviet Union was no longer the great threat. Therefore, this created a huge opportunity for the USA, obviously, but also its allies, for the Western world, to create a new and better world. And it removed the overriding need for the American alliance. He was still in favour of it at this stage, but it was less important for us to be in lockstep with the USA. It was more possible for Australia to develop an independent foreign policy, which he was strongly in favour of even back then. So, I would say his principles remained the same, but as the world changed, the expression of them changed. And I see more continuity than difference. Obviously, there were areas of difference, and you can argue it endlessly, I suppose. But he changed in line with the times.
Yeah. I've always thought he was a political orphan in the end. So he's a Liberal Party Prime Minister, but leaves the Liberal Party in later life. So the Liberal Party is not there to celebrate his legacy. And, of course, he's the giant slayer of Whitlam. And so the Labor Party's never going to have any truck with celebrating his legacy. So in the end, he has no one.
Yeah, both sides of
except
politics.
You.
Not just only me, I don't think. But both sides of politics, for their own reasons, disowned him the minute he lost power. Howard and Fraser never particularly got on and became enemies, I think it's fair to say. And so that part of the Liberal Party disowns him. Those who were in favour of what we broadly refer to as economic rationalism thought he'd been too slow, or it's been claimed he was resistant, which I disagree with, and I think the documentary record bears me out on that. So both sides of politics almost straight away want to dismiss him as, a figure of no significance or worth, including the Liberal Party, which is incredibly damaging.
Although he develops a friendship with Hawke and Whitlam post-politics.
Friendship, I wouldn't call it a friendship. They came to better understandings.
A meeting of the minds on some things.
Well, I think, this is my view, not necessarily Fraser's. I think Whitlam and Fraser discovered more in common with each other than either of them had with the modern expressions of their parties.
Yes, interesting.
But there were certainly areas of difference. I don't think either of them would describe the other as a friend, but they certainly came to an understanding and had a relationship that was not an antagonistic relationship. And Whitlam blamed Kerr more than Fraser for the dismissal.
Yeah. Well, it was Kerr's decision, wasn't it, ultimately, not Fraser's. Margaret Simons, thank you so much for talking to me today about Malcolm Fraser. And, of course, you've got your symposium at Trinity College in December on the 50th anniversary of the election of the Fraser government, which will be a suitable moment to take stock, reflect on that very important moment in our history and the legacy we still live with today.
I sincerely hope that it causes people to engage with this element of our history. Of course, people don't necessarily have to agree with me or with Malcolm on it, but I think it is so damaging to any political party to deny a significant part of its history. And in my view, that is what the Liberal Party has done with Fraser. And it's anti-historical, anti-intellectual, and ultimately damaging at a time when the party is trying to seek ways forward.
Well, thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.